I'm Art Techlow. I'm the Winnebago System Biologist in the Fisheries Program for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. And today I'm going to be talking about Lake Winnebago, the environmental history of Lake Winnebago, and basically covering the period from European exploration to the present. So that's roughly in the 1600s through the current day. When we look at Lake Winnebago, it's Wisconsin's largest inland lake. It's very big, 137,708 acres, but it's also very shallow, 21-foot maximum depth and a 15.5-foot average depth. A lot of shoreline, 85 miles, very heavily developed, and a very, very big watershed, and that's important to remember because that does have a big impact on the lake. When we talk about Lake Winnebago, though, we have to talk about the entire Winnebago Pool, and that includes Lake Winnebago and the upper lakes of Butamore, Winneconne, and Poygan. And that four-lake pool is managed, at least for water levels, by the two dams, one at Neenah and one at Menasha, at the Lower Fox River outlet of Lake Winnebago. Those dams were put in the mid-1850s, and they raised the water level historically by about 3 feet. And again, the Fox Wolf watershed is very big. Lake Winnebago is the end point of almost over 6,000 square miles of watershed. The area in the northern part, in the hashed area, is the Wolf River watershed. And to the south and southwest, the dotted area, as you can see on the map, is the Upper Fox watershed. One thing we need to clarify about Lake Winnebago is kind of an interesting side note, and a lot of people think Winnebago means stinking waters. That's not really true. You notice this very old map from 1738, a French map, and you see Lake Winnebago there labeled Lac de Pointe, and that's the name for the lake at the time. And what happened was when Nicolay came to Green Bay in 1634, he was told by the people he met, obviously the Native Americans, that 3 days' journey to the south, which would be up the Lower Fox River, was a route to the sea. And he named the people. He named the people he met. It's an Algonquin name that sounds like Winnebago. And that means people of the sea. When he got furthermore, he named Lake Winnebago and Green Bay, named Lake Winnebago Lac de Pointe, which means strong smell of seawater, because he thought he had found the route to the sea. And what happened was when the British came along, they mistranslated the British name and referred to the local natives as stinkards and as to Lake Winnebago as stinking water. So that's where that came from. It's totally false, and it had nothing to do with water quality. So we start with exploration, we go through the fur trade, and we go to settlement. That all happened over a period of a couple hundred years, starting in the 1600s. And we see an increased Lapham's book, The Geographical and Topographical History of Wisconsin. We see a description of Lake Winnebago, the earliest really good description. That's from 1844, and we'll go a little bit around the lake. The Neenah River enters the lake, so that's actually the Fox River enters the lake near its middle, and this is Oshkosh, as we see in the picture. And it leaves the lake at the northwest angle by two channels enclosing Doty's Island. So those are the twin channels of the Lower Fox River, one at Neenah, one at Menasha. Looks familiar. And the water, quoting Captain Cram in Lapham's book, is hard, and when not violently agitated is quite pellucid, which means clear, but sometimes turbid during long and severe blows, and has a depth sufficient for the purpose of navigation. It's kind of interesting the way people talk back then, or the way they spoke. But this shows Lake Winnebago in 1915 on the left at Menominee Park in Oshkosh, and the very same scene, almost 100 years later in 2012. It's just a little bit earlier, and they haven't put out the dock yet. On the northern extremity, the shore is low, having a narrow sandy beach for a rather long extent, and you can just see a little bit of the detail in the photo. It's hard to see, but you can see some beach ridges inland from the shore, and you can see some sandbars in the water, and it is a very shallow area. The receding shoreline, obviously, it was a much bigger water body at one time, but it is interesting to note that. On the east side, there immediately succeed the table of excellent land covered with the growth of heavy timber. And there's the east shore of Lake Winnebago, and then a very early photograph of the shoreline along Lake Winnebago about 100 years ago, heavily wooded. And further back on the east shore, the ground rises into a high ridge, and of course, you've got the limestone and sandstone, and you've got the Niagara escarpment. Basically, is what we're talking about. A very familiar topographical feature. On approaching the southern extremity of the lake, however, the stone and timber disappear and the land becomes a rich grassy prairie coming quite to the water's edge. Now, this is down in Fond du Lac. There's a larger photo here. This is from a very old lithograph from the 1800s, and the scene it was labeled duck hunting on Lake Winnebago near the Marshes in Fond du Lac. And obviously, this is not what the lake looks like in Fond du Lac today. You can see very far back. There's a little building, and it appears to be a church. Some people speculate that may be St. Francis Church in Fond du Lac, the earliest church that was built in Fond du Lac. But this is what Fond du Lac looks like today. The only wetlands around are Supley's Marsh, down right north of the city of Fond du Lac. So that there's a dramatically different scene between what we just saw and what we see today. And how did that happen? Well, for one thing, the dams were built in 1850s at the outlet of Lake Winnebago, and that raised the water level historically by 3 feet, and that caused a lot of flooding and loss of those wetlands initially. And the idea for those dams was, of course, for commercial navigation. In this map of Wisconsin, basically, what I need to show here is that from Green Bay to Lake Winnebago, the Lower Fox River is a navigation route that needed to be basically made navigable by locks and dams. And then from Lake Winnebago through the Upper Fox to the lower portion of the central part of the state, the Upper Fox going to Portage, and then the Portage Canal dug to the Wisconsin River, and then downstream to the Mississippi River. So it was basically a cross-strait navigation route, and that's why the dams were put in, because they were put in all along that route, at least up and through the lower and Upper Fox River, and locks were associated with those dams to facilitate navigation. However, once that operation got to Wisconsin River, the Portage Canal was dug connecting the Wisconsin River. It was discovered that the Wisconsin River was basically untamable because of shifting channels and sandbars and everything like that, so it never went any further. But there was local traffic between Green Bay and occasionally Green Bay and Lake Winnebago, especially, and all the way to Portage. And occasionally there was traffic all the way to the Mississippi River, but that was very rare. Most of it was local traffic, and there was a lot of steamer traffic in the late 1800s right through the early 1900s. And this is the steamer Thistle coming into Omro. Later on, that commercial traffic basically disappeared because railroads came to the area, and they were the competition that beat the steamboat traffic. But recreational navigation was getting underway. This is about a 100-year-old photo of a typical family outing, I guess you could say, on Lake Butamore. And note all the wild rice and emergent vegetation and other wetland plants in the background. And here's a boating outing on Lake Butamore today, and that's dramatically different from the last scene. And so why did that happen? Again, the water levels were the key player. And what we're showing right now is the typical water level of today under the management plan, but used by the Corps of Engineers. That dark line shows the current water level management plan, and almost mirror opposite of what you would have for a natural hydrologic regime. In other words, snow melt and spring rains bring the water up. They basically taper off under a natural situation throughout the growing season for aquatic plants, which is ideal for those plants, wetland plants. Today we have the opposite, and that causes a lot of problem with that aquatic vegetation out there, the fish and wildlife habitat. Here's another illustration. This is on western Lake Butamore, and these are duck hunters aiming their shotguns at the cameraman. He happens to be standing on the roof of a floating shack. I always tell people this one is the first DNR era photo, but the point of this photo is to show the dense emergent marsh and the wild rice and all that wetland vegetation in the background. It's probably a mile or two at least to the upland shoreline of the lake. And this is about a 100-year-old photo also, and here's what this area looks like today. It's very dramatic. Shallow, turbid, open water. The marshes are totally gone from this photo. There are some remnants, but a lot of wetlands were lost over time. And the mechanism for that basically was when the water level was raised, a lot of what was sedge meadow and lowland prairie became inundated, either drowned outright or floated and became buoyant and literally floated off into the lake and disintegrated downstream. And that's what this photo shows. This is from April during the spring floods in 1906. This caption of this photo was 300 acres of Butamore bog lodged against the Oshkosh Avenue Bridge in Oshkosh. This would be on the west bank of the river looking to the east, and that's the old Payne Lumber Company in the background across the river, and currently that facility is where the modern day Fertility is located. So you can see how dramatic some of this wetland loss was. And today we still have a little bit of that happening on Lake Winnebago with our Lake Butamore and the other upriver lakes, I should say, whenever we get very high water, or even when we have a higher than normal water in the summer as a stable water level, we've got unprotected pieces of wetlands breaking off and floating downstream and disintegrating. So we went from basically a pristine rivery marsh ecosystem to a more very turbid, shallow open water system in about 150 years' time. There were a number of attempts in the past and continue to this day in protecting some of those wetlands. Some of those in the past weren't well thought out, and this happens to show some of the car bodies that were used in conjunction with rock riprap to try to, as a cheap way of trying to preserve the wetlands. And at least, I always tell people in the foreground area, at least they could have shut the car doors. But the point is, there were attempts made to protect the wetlands, but some of them weren't very well thought out or well designed in the past. And here's an interesting photo that you can still find some of those car bodies out on the upper lakes in some of the marshes yet. Most of them had to be removed, but some of them still are in place. And again, here's a photo from the south shore of Lake Butamore in the 1930s. You can see the kid there in the foreground in his little boat. He's in some wild rice, and there's a lot of wild rice and bulrushes in the background. The next photo is the identical area, taken about 70 years later. It's a dramatic difference. So we've gone from very dense emergent marsh through a transition of sparse emergent marsh and dense submergence. And currently, most of our wetland plants in the lake are submergent plants, but they are valuable plants. They're needed for fish and wildlife habitat. They're needed for shoreline protection to mitigate wave or attenuate wave action, and they're needed to clean the water because as particles in the water in the form of sediment and anything else move through the water column, when that water is slowed by standing vegetation, those particles drop out due to the velocity being slowed and the water clears up. So we've got fish and wildlife habitat, shoreline buffering, and water filtration. All these lakes need some of that as some vital component to the lake ecosystem. Another situation is shoreline development, particularly along Lake Winnebago. This photo is from the 1930s, I believe, at 1939. This is on the west shore of Lake Winnebago, north of Oshkosh, but it shows some wetlands along these peninsulas. It shows a rather undeveloped shoreline, fairly natural shoreline for what we could get for Lake Winnebago. This is the 1930s, and this same photograph today, you see a lot of development. You see some of those wetlands have been filled and channelized, and you can't blame people for wanting to use the lake or be near the lake. It's very desirable, but you can see that there is heavy development. There's been some wetland fill that's taken place basically throughout the lake and throughout the pool. And you also notice the water clarity here is pretty bad. This happens to be in summer during a heavy blue-green algae bloom. And here again, we've got a situation up on Lake Butamore here in this case, where we've got channelization, heavy development on the shoreline. We've had some spring rains, it looks like, and a lot of runoff coming in through these channels right out into the lake. And one more time, speaking of runoff, we've got our big problem with water pollution per se is not from industrial or point sources. That's been fairly well taken care of through the Clean Water Act and a lot of other efforts in terms of spending millions and millions of dollars. Right now, what we've got in the current day is water pollution from non-point sources. And this shows on the west shore of Lake Winnebago. I believe this is Calumet Harbor, but you can see the snow there is melting. We may have had some rain associated with that. We've got higher elevations over there, and we've got some real runoff situations carrying sediments and the associated nutrients right into Lake Winnebago. This is rather dramatic, but you can see this almost every year after heavy rain or any time after heavy rain. And what happens if we don't have rooted aquatic plants in significant amounts in the lakes? What happens is the nutrients that are washed into the water or released from the sediments are not going to be wasted in nature, and they're utilized by something. And if they're not by green growing rooted plants, they're going to be used by algae. And here we've got a pretty big algae bloom, a rather dramatic one, on Lake Winnebago off the city of Oshkosh. And here we're looking at using a Secchi disc as a measure of water clarity, but you can see the algae clumped together and you can see very poor water clarity. And the problem with poor water clarity, it shades out sunlight and you don't get the necessary sunlight for those green growing rooted aquatic plants. And here's what algae looks like as kind of a side note when it really gets thick and gets into some areas where the water is stagnant. It pushes into channels and harbors and back bays. And these pretty colors are actually the color of decaying algae, that blue-green algae in decomposing there. And it's a real putrid mess. So this is probably the opposite, the ideal condition. And here we've got a bed of wild celery, the water. You can see this person standing in the boat is where the photograph is taken from. That's wild celery, mostly in the foreground and all the way as far as you can see. And it's very, very clear water. And that's what plants do, in addition to providing fish and wildlife habitat, of course. And this wild celery is interesting. It's a valuable plant, particularly to waterfowl. Here's the tubers. They're lodged in the sediments, and if the plant will break off at the water sediment interface in late summer, early fall, and leave these tubers in the bottom. And those are starchy, and they're like eating potatoes if you're a duck. And that's what diving ducks like canvasbacks and redheads and scaup feed on. And also, this is how the new growth starts from next year. The tips of those tubers are where the new plant will start growing from. That's basically how wild celery spreads. And these are the ducks we're talking about. These are all lesser scaup with one redhead if you're sharp and looking at this photo. But these are diving ducks, not the typical park ducks you see that are eating day-old bakery, but these are real migratory waterfowl that depend a lot on those plants. And of course, the submergent aquatic vegetation and wetland plants are a vital component to the life cycle of a lot of fish, including panfish, as seen here, perch and sunfish, as well as bass, largemouth bass, northern pike, and other species. And this is an ideal situation, probably as good as we can get nowadays for a natural situation on the lakes. I've got deeper water in the foreground with submergent plants, grading into sparse emergent plants in the background, all the way to a dense emergent marsh as the lake shallows up, and then eventually hitting an upland shoreline and grading right into those grasslands and woodlands. This is almost an ideal situation. And on the opposite, we've got, as you can see here, none of the wetland plants. We've got turbid open water, probably very shallow, but very dirty, not growing plants. We've got hard armored shoreline, a manicured, probably fertilized lawn going right into the water. And you can't fault someone for having a pretty looking house and property, but we don't necessarily would maybe want the entire shorelines of the lakes to look like this because it tends to be rather harmful to the lake ecosystem. And here's what happens when we do have excessive fertility and it does cause a problem for people. Here we've got some algae, filamentous algae, stuck in the back bay. You can see the shoreline along the background. You've got some houses back there, and this presents a real problem to the lakeshore owners in getting their boat out or trying to swim or even being around when this stuff starts to decompose. So that's a brief history of the lakes. I end with this pellucid or not. That's just a great word that Captain Cram was quoted as saying. It means clear water, and basically that's what we have on Lake Winnebago. The situation of what do we want to do with our lake and how do we want it to look.
All right.